Okay, so we can get started. Hi, my name is Leah. I work at Teton County Library, and you are joining us for our Writing to Remember Obituary and Eulogy writing workshop. And it's the third installment of our Let's Talk About Death series. And this is being recorded, so you can refer back to it later. And all the videos will be posted on the library's Let's Talk About Death website. And so all of the past events are there as well as supplemental info that we posted there, like books that refer to it. So thank you for joining us. And tonight this is a nice collaboration between the library and the Jackson Hole News and Guide. And we've got 4 reporters here tonight. We have Billy Arnold, wave your hand. And then we've got Mark Huffman, Tom Hallberg, and Emily, I'm not sure if I'm saying your last name, Muir? Okay, is she here?
She has not logged in yet, but I'm sure she will.
Okay. And she'll be here. And then we also have Joanna Love right there too. She's the leader of all of those fine folks and keeping our Fourth Estate strong. So thanks for joining us. I'll turn it over, I think, to Billy.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Billy Arnold. I am the county government reporter over here at the News and Guide. I guess I can kind of give an overview of like what we're thinking for the night here. I'll have everyone too from the News and Guide introduce themselves in a second. But just to give you give some background on where this workshop came from. I think it's a first for a lot of us. I think it's a first for an online workshop for us over at the News and Guide. It's a first, I think, for teaching a workshop about writing obituaries. So bear with us as we figure it all out. But where this all came from is Leah and I took a hike on Snow King a while ago. And I basically told her that I have this like weird hobby. I don't know if it's a hobby or a practice, but I kind of keep, and right now it's mostly a mental log, but a mental and sometimes a written log of memories and whatnot from friends and family members' lives. So for my grandparents, I have a number of stories that I have kind of just kept in the back of my head and asked them to repeat whenever I'm around them. And then with some other friends, there's certain stories that I tell over and over and over about those friends. And the purpose I do it, which is not something that I think often talk about, is because I've kind of got them stored up there for 2 reasons. One, in case one of them happens to get married anytime soon and I have to write a wedding speech, or 2, just in case anybody dies and I have to write a eulogy. And so that being said, I have never written an obituary, haven't written an eulogy. I just have kind of this practice of keeping them all in my head, which is why I roped Emily, Tom, and Mark into this, because in the newsroom, we frequently have to write about people shortly after they die or pass away. We've had to do that a number of times this year. Mark, as I think I mentioned in the description for this workshop, has won an award last year for his obituary, part obituary, part profile, part eulogy for Billy Saunders. And Tom and Emily have both written about members of the community who have passed away as well. We'll talk a little bit later on about how we decide what stories become news obituaries and end up in the A section, the news section of the paper. And I asked Joanna to pop on just to talk a little bit about how the obituaries that you might see in the Valley section under the obituaries section online comes up. But yeah, generally what we're hoping to do tonight is just kind of talk a little bit about, writing, as Leah mentioned, to remember people, and how to think about writing about people and telling stories about people, and writing a eulogy that people that both encapsulate someone's life and that people are interested in reading. So that's kind of where we're at. Like I said, in the short little article I wrote, we don't want it to be all doom and gloom. We imagine there's people here from for all different reasons. Somebody might be here because they've recently had a loved one, whether it's a human or a pet pass away. Other people might be here just because they're interested in genealogy. They like reading obituaries, and they like reading about people. So we've got some stuff to talk about. I've got a pretty fantastic obituary that Mark wrote for his cat. Docked up here, and what we're kind of hoping is that it's not just us talking. We got a little thing of prompt later on to have some people write a paragraph or two of their own, and we'll have some discussion too. But with that, I'll kind of let everybody else introduce themselves. Emily said she's on her way over. She was stuck reporting another story, but she'll be here in a minute. But yeah, Tom or Mark, if you guys want to introduce yourself, maybe talk a little bit about what you write about and how you got roped in, that'd be awesome.
I can go for it. I'm Tom Hallberg. My main beats are education and healthcare. So right now I basically write about COVID, but I started out as a copy editor at the paper, and I wrote a lot of feature stories. And as part of that, I've kind of picked up our backcountry skiing/skiing beat that I share with Billy now. And that kind of led to how I got roped into this. I wrote a news obituary about Stephen Macdonald, who died in a bicycling accident over the summer. And he was a longtime boot fitter, longtime mountain bike guide. And that kind of dovetailed with the features that I've written before. And I think that's what I'm going to talk about that later. And I think that was kind of the motivation to include me in this. And I'll turn it over to Mark.
I should say first, I do write cat obituaries, but it's sort of a sideline. It's just because cats die and somebody ought to remember them. If you're in the newspaper business, one thing you want to remember is if you're going to run people's obituaries and animals' obituaries, you don't want to put them on the same page, because some people are going to be upset by that. It's just the way it is. So you better find someplace else to put all the dogs and the cats and the favorite horses and things like that. I've covered all sorts of beats in my newspaper career here and in Colorado. Mostly now I write business and I edit copy. And I seem to have fallen into writing obituaries via writing about history a lot of the times at the News and Guide, just because I work with a newsroom full of children and I automatically get all the news stories that contain the phrase 100 years ago this week. Those are automatically assigned to me. So I think that's how I sort of slipped into obituaries. Though I've written them my whole career. I mean, if you're in the newspaper business, it's sometimes hard to differentiate between writing a story about someone just dying. People are killed in car accidents and those get written and they're not actually obituaries. But sometimes when someone dies, you automatically think, oh, I know that person. Or I remember that person doing something really interesting or important or funny. And you just have an urge that maybe it's worth writing a few hundred words about them, just to remind everybody of some fascinating part that they played in the local scene.
And if Mark, I think Julia in the chat piece mentioned the piece you wrote about I can't remember his first name, but Grubman this week in the paper. And I guess maybe just to start off, would you call that an obituary? Like, how would you describe that article?
I wouldn't call that an obituary, but the same question crossed my mind while I was writing it, because it stars somebody who died about a year and 2 weeks ago. And part of the story is the fact that he's dead. This is a guy who's building a gigantic house in over by Snow King, but it's basically a place to put his immense art collection. And then he died a little more than a year ago, but the project is going on under the direction of his son. So it's just kind of a bizarre story in which somebody dying is sort of an integral part, though. And then, I ended up talking about the guy. Who was he and what was his history? So in that, it's kind of an obituary. He was known to a few people here, but not to many. He's like a semi-reclusive rich guy. And so it shares some obituary parts, but also being a story about the biggest house ever built in Jackson, and about an art collection, and a guy who was to some people he was a rich jerk, and to other people he was like a philanthropist. So it was a big conglomeration of things in which death played a big part.
Sure. And maybe a little bit later on, we can talk more specifically about like the difference between, a news obituary. So there's a difference between a news obituary and then the obituary that probably a lot of people here are interested in writing, which is an obituary that would end up in the Valley pages. But Mark, what would you call it? How would you distinguish between the two? And what's happening there, because obviously there's a lot going on. You just mentioned that story is not necessarily an obituary, but a story where death plays a big part. Mm-hmm. And how would you though distinguish between like an obituary that ends up in the A section and the Valley section?
Well, to the newspaper, the things that most people think of as the obituaries back in the Valley section, those are what we call submitted obituaries. Those are written by the family. And in our case, we don't do very much with them. We edit them just to clean them up and to put them in style and fix the spelling or anything like that, just try to help them. We don't really interfere with what people want to say in those things. And some of them are quite good, and others are basically kind of eulogy things where people are publicly feeling bad and remembering someone that they loved who died. A news obituary, generally, you want somebody who was a story is when they were alive. It's not just that they're dead. There was one last year, unfortunately, I was out of the office and somebody else got to write it. It was Captain Bob, Bob Morris. Captain Bob is like a character in this town for 40 or 50 years. And when he finally died as a very old man, I mean, he was a great story. He was a great story when he was alive, and when he died, it gave you a chance to tell that whole story all over again. So, we call that, when we do those, we call them news obituaries. The terminology may vary from newspaper to newspaper, but that's generally the way we did it. And the ones you see that, sometime a few months ago, I did Grant Larson, who grew up here and who is well known. He was our state senator for a dozen years, businessman, a nice guy. When he died, his family did submit an obituary, which we ran as well. But when we heard he was dead, we said, this guy stands out in the community. He knew everybody who's been in, say, Rotary for the last 60 years. He knew everybody in business, during that time. He knew everybody in politics in Jackson for that time. So we just thought, from our point of view, it was worth our own take. And our take is a little bit different because we're not, we like to tell the story, but I mean, it doesn't quite have quite the same reverential touch that a family's obituary does.
Sure. And Joanna, if you are on the line, it would be awesome if you could talk a little bit, and Mark, if you want to chime in too. The News and Guide, part of why we, why there's such a large presence of us here is because the News and Guide's obituary service, the submitted obituaries that Mark was talking about, one that would be written by a family or someone else like that, are free at the News and Guide. And I believe that's a bit of a dying trend in the newspapers, which are also slowly dwindling around the country. So Joanna, I don't know if you want to speak to that. And Mark, if you have anything to add, please chime in.
Sure. I've only worked at the News and Guide since 1997, but ever since the newspapers in Jackson were founded more than a century ago, obituaries have always been something that people turn to us for. And we really philosophically believe that nobody should be turned away because they can't afford to print an obituary. As newspapers dwindle, community newspapers are being bought up and by these giant corporations, which suck the lifeblood out of them and then suck away their resources, and then they just crumble and die. And so so many of these struggling newspapers across the country have just started charging for obituaries, and some of them have always done it. It's always been a revenue stream for the New York Times or for the Commercial Appeal in Memphis, where I grew up. They've always charged for obituaries, and they charge by the column inch. So an obit can cost you anywhere from a few hundred to thousands of dollars in these major cities, and even in the small towns. It's big business. And with the financial situation a lot of newspapers are in, they can't afford to turn it down. So in Jackson, we're independently owned for the last 8 years by Kevin Olson, who lives down in Melody Ranch, and he's been here for 20 years as well, almost. And he just really believes strongly, as I do, that it's a service to our readers and to our community and our subscribers to be able to tell the stories of these people who have lived here and made the Valley what it is. News obits are something we do on top and above and beyond that. So when there's somebody, it's kind of a high bar. You either have to have changed so many lives in this community in kind of a public way. And like Mark said, it has to be a good story. Or we also do some news obits for somebody who dies tragically young in the mountains or a car crash and was deeply a part of this place.
Cool. Yeah, and I guess from there, I think we can kind of get into it. The first thing we were going to do, if you read about this in the paper or anything today, you'll notice that I attached, and as Mark said, with pets, they tend to be run in a different place than obituaries tend to be run in a different place in the newspaper than they are if they are about people, obituaries, if they're about people. And so if you read the article online, I attached a clipping of a, just, to start it off on a lighter note, a clipping of a obituary Mark wrote for his cat, Rusty, a few years ago. And I'm going to share my screen, and people are welcome to read that. And I'll just kind of give everybody a chance to read that real quick. For those who aren't aware, like Tom and I both studied creative writing at various points in our lives. And the way a lot of writing workshops go is you get something small to read. People read it, and then there's a kind of a quick conversation about it. So I figured we would start off with that. And for people who are listening in on their phones, I see there's a few people there. I wasn't planning to do a staged reading of the Rusty the Cat obituary, but I will. And we can just kind of talk about that as a starting point about just what, and then as I'm reading, if you just think about what, maybe first, would you call this an obituary? And two, what makes the story here good? And we can talk about that. And Mark's obviously on the phone, so he probably hasn't had a full 30-person critics array before, but I think it's a good jumping off point. And then we'll probably go in, Mark, Tom, Emily, and I will each talk about a story that we've written. Mark, Tom, and Emily about obituaries they've written, and myself about a profile. And we can kind of just talk a little bit about that process, who that person was, why did it come to be, and et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, I'll start. Let me share this screen about Rusty the Cat. And Mark, if you want to plug your ears and run away, I get it. I would want you to. So
I would just say also that beloved cat Rusty, if it is an obituary. It's about him and his character, which is what you want to do in an obituary. But also, because it's about a cat, I took every aspect or characteristic of obituaries and sort of cranked it to the left a little bit. You know, it's a, you know, it takes all the same methods, but sort of uses them in a dead cat sort of way.
There we go. Here we go. I'll try not to laugh, and I might. Cool. So the title of this this piece is also newsroom famous, but and true to what Mark was saying before, it ran as an advertisement in the paper, not in the newspaper, not in the newsprint. But you know, it kind of goes something like this: the headline is "Rusty, Unadoptable Cat Dead." And it goes like, Rusty the cat died September 3rd in an automobile accident near his home in West Jackson. Rusty's origins remain mysterious. In 2011, a family in Wilson returned home after being gone for 2 weeks and found him when they opened their garage. After being apprehended by county authorities, Rusty was examined by a doctor who described him in less than glowing terms: starving, dehydrated, diarrheal, probably feral. The likely outcome, the doc said, was that the cat should be killed, but Rusty was willing to eat, and so he lived. 8 months later, he was still in cat jail, maybe because he wouldn't let anyone touch him. No way, hands off. Enter a likely fool, Mark Huffman, who liked Rusty's looks and the fact that he was friendly with other cats. After visiting a half a dozen times, Huffman was able to touch Rusty with a fingertip, so he told the attendant he would take the cat. She looked surprised. She opened a drawer, found some thick leather gloves that went up near her elbows, and grabbed Rusty with both hands. Rusty went instantly from dormant to Category 5 hurricane, twisting, spitting, screaming, paws and claws. She stuffed him in a carrier, flipped the door shut, and in a chirpy voice said, "There you go." At his new home, Rusty stayed in the box for 2 hours. When we finally decided he seemed to have calmed down, we opened the door. He came out so fast you couldn't focus on him. Hit 4 windows, bonk, 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 and disappeared. Rusty hid inside a 1-bedroom house for 2 weeks. Even after realizing he wasn't going to be killed and eaten, Rusty continued to fall back frequently on hiding. Dog, hide. Neighbors, hide. Thunder, hide under the bed, make pitiful yowling noise. But he mostly got used to things. He liked to eat, though he refused canned cat food, insisting on dry only. He turned down every proffered treat, but liked milk. He was friendly with mice in a carnivorous sort of way, liked to sleep, chase laser pointer Dot, sleep some more, ambush his adopted sister Grace. Loved having his butt scratched and stopped flinching when you reached for him. To his last day, though, he would not allow himself to be picked up. No. He also, like most cats, couldn't settle for one name. To Rusty, he added Russell, Russ, Rusty Bear, Rusticus, Maximus, Happy Man, and Good Boy. Grace thought of him as other cat. Rusty is now gone. Let's imagine it is to cat heaven, that he is now there, hiding. So that's the whole thing, and I welcome anyone to unmute yourself there. And if you want to chime in just on, you know, and thanks for the claps, Tom, chime in and just like, you know, what about this rings true to an obituary, like Tom said, and what, you know, reading it made you think of. And, you know, does it come full circle? Whatever your thoughts are, throw them out there, and we'd love to hear them. All right, we got anyone?
Oh, I'm not unmuted. So I can share what I was thinking as I heard you reading it, which I didn't necessarily think of the first time that I read this, because I've read this several times in the last couple days. Because I think it's wonderful. And I thought, to me, as I was hearing Billy reading it, is that it almost strikes me more as a eulogy than an obituary. And I guess I see the difference as being like, an obituary is something that like you write about someone, and then a eulogy being something you speak about someone. And it almost felt like a speech that you would actually give at, you know, at Rusty's funeral, were he to have one. And I think what I got from it that I really appreciated, or what made me think of it as a eulogy, is really that like you saw you saw Rusty through the writer's eyes. So like that was Rusty as like Mark Huffman almost perceived him. And that's kind of, I think, how we approach writing obituaries, is that you're trying to find a way to like describe that person or perceive that person. And when it's very personal, like Rusty, you know, I think it can be funny. But I think that it's really heartfelt when it's about somebody that you knew, whether that person is a person or a cat.
Right. And I think, like, to riff off of what Tom is saying, is that when we write about other people, we want our audience to see who we see in that person or the cat or who we knew. So like to reveal another, like, the not secret life of, but here is some maybe what you don't know about this person or my pet, and this is my relationship to them.
Totally. And I think to add to it, and participants are welcome to add too. We're happy to, you know, toss ideas back and forth amongst ourselves. But it's not overly complicated, right? Like we don't see a whole picture of Rusty's life, but we see, I think from this, a defining characteristics of Rusty's life. Like he sounds pretty crusty. You know, sounds like he had an attitude and had a knack for hiding. And all of those things come through. There's like one theme throughout the entire, you know, whatever 300, 400 words this is. But when you finish it, this vignette that Mark starts with, of the scene of picking him up from the shelter, tells you a lot about the cat. And then it also tells you a lot about the cat that it never changed, except for a little bit. So like, I don't know, it's kind of, yeah, it's kind of nice so that it's focused like that for me. Yeah.
I would say the lesson of the Rusty obit is that most obits could use, well, first it has the advantage of not having to list who his parents were, where he went to school, the jobs he held, how he was Rotarian of the Year in 1983, you know, stuff like that, that really doesn't interest the general readership. It was all about character. You should if you're going to write a nice obituary about somebody, I would recommend that you try to do some of that, because we have obituaries submitted to us that tell us things like where 90-year-old dearly departed people went to elementary school. And it's not really particularly interesting to the people who are turning the pages of the newspaper and say, oh, look, so-and-so died. I want to know, I want to be reminded of that person. I want to hear some stories about that person. They don't care, you know, where you went to basic training or what year your first child was born and that sort of thing. What they want to hear is, what they'd like to hear is, tell me about the time that he did something funny. Tell me about the time he did something brave. Tell me about the time that he did something stupid and then used to tell a story himself and laugh at himself. You know, if you could come up with that kind of story, that goes a lot further than just a recitation of jobs and places you lived and that sort of thing. You know, it makes it a character sketch more than like a resume. And that's, you know, really something that'll make it stand out in people's minds when they read it. They may even read it and recognize the person, even if they haven't heard that story or that joke or that thing he or she used to say all the time. They may hear that and say, oh yeah, that's just like him. And that's worth a lot more and is a much better tribute, like I say, than you know, what his mother's maiden name was and that sort of thing, which is all very fine if you're doing genealogy. And maybe that's what you're doing, which is okay too. Maybe you just want an obituary as part of a genealogy sort of family project. But you really do better with personality than you do with facts from a long time ago.
Sure. And which is not to say, that listing where somebody went to elementary school isn't valuable to some people. Of course it is. And I
Well,
think
then let me just say that I went to Tulsa Street Elementary School until the 3rd grade, and then I went to Mayall Street Elementary School.
And I was going to say too, like most of the Rusty Obituary is chronological, and yet you bring out the character sketch in it. Like, oh, okay. So how, like, I think a lot of people say, oh, if I'm going to tell about a life, I'm going to like list it chronologically, which you don't have to. You can totally deviate from completely. Like, I like the prompts that you just gave. Like, when did they do something brave? When did, they do something out of the ordinary that's not chronologically? But you did both. Like, have it like, here is the series of events, but here is the character.
And you'll also find if you read obituaries in different places, there are different styles. The New York Times has obituaries every day, and they are generally pretty much a kind of resume thing. They're not, when you see character in them, it's a little bit more rare. They tend to write about dead politicians and dead opera singers and things like that. And they're a little bit lean on funny stories. But other people write obituaries, other newspapers or magazines, do go for like the personality and may just tell one story about somebody for half the obituary. And then all of a sudden just say, he was born this day, he went to this school, he was married twice, blah, blah, and wrap it up. But they'll rely on telling that one story to bring off, to communicate the character of the person, which is, like I say, there's different styles, and you can use any of them or mix them up any way you like.
Sure. And it kind of goes, especially if you are writing your own obituary and submitting it to us, the News and Guide, it really goes for what are you trying to do there? Do you want to remember the person for the character, or, say it is someone that, was 95 years old and lived in this community for all 95 of those years, and writing, where they went to elementary school, people might be like, oh, wow, that's interesting. I remember this person, and I know who this is that's passed away. So it all kind of comes down to what you want. But if you're telling a story of someone, those details, and it's something that I think we work on just with everything, whether we're writing an obituary or something that we do, which is pretty similar to an obituary that we write every week, which is a close-up. You're telling a story about a person and usually trying to zero in on one story, and then using that story to tell the story of that person's life, like, sprinkling in how old they are, sprinkling in what they do for work, all that sort of stuff in there. So for us, as we're writing a story and trying to tell that picture, the difference between an obituary and a profile, like a close-up, isn't that major, other than, and this is just my perspective, but from reading them, other than that person is dead, and there's more of a responsibility to fully document and really treat that life well. So but yeah, maybe while we're there, we could go and we could move and start talking about some of the I will stop sharing my screen. Oh, did I do that already? Great. We can move on to just started talking about some of the obits that we've written. And so I'll share this again. I think I have Mark kind of going first here, talking just about, talking about his Billy Saunders obit. And what I was hoping to have each of the writers do, and hopefully Emily will be able to join us here. She lives in Kelly and was just driving home, so she can talk a little bit about hers when she gets back. But yeah, just the kind of 4 things I was hoping for people to talk about was, who was this person? How did the news obituary come about? Like, how did you decide that this was a story worth putting in the news section of the paper? And then kind of what we were just talking about, why did you include the story, or like the main story that you chose to? And just at a high level, how much did you leave out? You don't have to talk about all that stuff, but those are things that you could mention. And yeah, maybe Mark, we could start with you, and if you want to talk about Billy Saunders here.
We decided to write Billy because the first thing we knew about Billy being dead was just as the sort of thing that ends up as a little short newspaper story. It was a highway patrol report. He was killed in an accident. And, and you hear those all the time. But when I heard it, and there are probably other people there too had the same idea. But when I heard it, I thought, oh, I know that guy. That's that old guy that I've met a few times in the last 30 years. And I knew he was interesting, but I didn't know a lot about him. But when I started asking, it turned out the instinct was right, because he had been born on a homestead on what's part of the elk refuge now, and he's delivered by his grandmother because the doctor couldn't get there. And he was in the Marines when he was 18 and was fighting the Japanese, and he ran a rodeo, and he skied on homemade wooden skis that his dad made on Snow King before there was a chairlift. And it just all kept, every time I heard something about him, it was like another fact that made me say, oh yeah, this is a story. This guy's fascinating. And and then when a couple of people told me the story, they'd ask him about, going ashore at Peleliu, this island, and it's held by the Japanese. And they asked him about wading ashore. And what he told them was he was worried about his cigarettes getting wet. A little goofy story like that, made him seem real. And when I knew I was right, the whole instinct was right, when he had a memorial ceremony about a week or 10 days after he died, then at his ranch in Bondurant. He's got a whole slew of kids and grandkids and stuff who live up from here to Pinedale and all around. But I go down there, and his memorial ceremony is held, and there's like easy 400 people there. And I said, oh yeah, the instinct is right. I thought this was a story. If you go to somebody's funeral and there's 400 people, you know that you found somebody that's important, especially if it's in Bondurant.
Sure. And here, just real quick here, let me just see if I can find, I just shared, oh, never mind, I can't find that window, but we had some pictures from that funeral, which was pretty cool to see. So that whole obit, Mark dug back and found, obviously that photo that I had just shared of him skiing on the pass in like 1956. And then we had pictures from the funeral and a profile of him from a long time ago. But it really stuck out. And that was the one that Mark won, I think, 2 awards for last year. And so pretty cool story. Tom, if you want to talk a little bit about, if I can just remember his name, about the story that you wrote about Stephen Macdonald,
Yep.
That would be awesome.
Sweet. So I guess quick backstory on who Stephen Macdonald was. He was, I think his wife described him as a skid in the story that I wrote. And so he was kind of one of those people who moved here to ski for a few years, and instead of deciding to do what many of us do and find a professional job at some point, he just kept doing what he loved, which was skiing and mountain biking. And he did whatever he could to do it. And he died earlier this year. And it was an example of why it helps to have people who've been in the community for a long time in the newsroom, because I didn't know who he was. And I live in Victor. I've worked at the paper for going on, I think, 4 years now. And so I don't have a lot of institutional knowledge, but Joanna called me and said, we need someone to write this story. It looks like you have time. It fits, your interest in the things that you've written. Can you write this today? It was on a Tuesday that we found out. And so it being a news obit, I tried to track down the details of how he died. And that was more, I think, standard reporting, which was calling, he died in Iowa. And so I called a police department there to try to figure out what happened, track down a police report. But I think that really the meat of the news obit was talking to people that he knew. And I started talking with a coworker, then I got a boss, and then from there I got another boss, and from there I got his wife, which is honestly that's sort of a difficult thing to approach. Learn, like, knowing as a reporter how to approach somebody who may be grieving is, there's not really like a guidebook for that. But in talking to all those people, really the question I started with was, who was he as a person? And then can you describe stories that you remember of him? And I think why I approached it that way is that I'm from a creative writing background. I don't actually have much training in journalism. And I think of a story like this almost in like scenes about him that move, from one to the other, and they build this character sketch that everybody's been talking about. And I started with, he ran for mayor twice. He didn't win, but his wife told me what I thought was a great story about how it was all white people running for mayor, and they had a Spanish interpreter, and he spoke Spanish. And so, kind of being curmudgeonly, and he actually answered all of his answers in Spanish and had them translated to English for, most of the native English speakers. And I chose that story because I felt like it captured his sort of iconoclastic personality, and it was a good jumping off point to really put him like in his place in the community. And I think I really approached it looking for nuggets like that to show, like, what's something that I can describe about what he did that really shows who he was. And I think that, instead of recitating, like, I could have written that, like, he ran for mayor, he worked at an excavation company, but those things, I think writing it from a narrative standpoint, as opposed to like a recitation of facts, creates a framework in which you can put those things in there. But really let the character of the person who it was guide the way that the story goes.
Sure. And yet when I thought of this obituary and asked Tom to hop in here, I thought exactly of that. I thought about that, and it's on the screen, the the memory that Stephen Macdonald's wife had of him, immediately when I was thinking about, memorable obits I'd read in the paper, because it was so unique and it stood out. And, not every person is going to run for mayor twice and, get up on stage and to a all English speaking crowd, answer all of the questions in Spanish. And it's pretty unique. But like every person who passes away has a story. And if you are writing their obituary and have something to say about them, you'll probably remember, like, you can probably think back and say, oh, well, okay, what's a story I tell about this person a lot? And if it's a story that you tell about that person a lot, other people will probably want to read it, even if nobody laughs when you tell the story about it, which is kind of how it goes when I tell a lot of stories about my friends. But, it's interesting, and it shows people who that person is. And Joanna actually, we hadn't talked about this, but Joanna sent me 2 obits that she had written, and one was of Bob Dornan, who obviously was a pretty big figure around here. And I was going to have Joanna talk a little bit about that obituary, because I think people will find it interesting. And yeah, Joanna, if you can think of like what the story that stood out to you in that obituary, that would be awesome if you could talk a little bit to that, and I'll flip over and put it up on the screen.
Yeah, I'm reading through this 5 years later, and I'm dumbfounded that I didn't put the best thing in. I think that as a writer, as a writer, you're like a wine, you get better with age. And I can't believe that I didn't put the best thing in. So I guess I'll start with the best thing that is not in this obituary, that his friends and family told me, mainly just his friends. I don't typically interview the family as much, like Tom was saying, because one, they're grieving, and two, because they get their say in the Valley section. They write the family obit, but there's so many stories and gems with the person, and like all these tangential people around them that are shocked and in grief as well, but they're not quite as close as a family member. They're not worrying about how the mortgage is going to get transferred from one person to another. They've got enough time and sort of bandwidth to reflect more on the person's character. So Bob Dornan, he owned Dornan's, obviously, and worked in the family business, and created this world famous wine shop there. And he loved wine, and he also he loved to socialize. He loved the those before times, before COVID, right? Like he loved to gather around with a bottle of wine and people, and just like tip one back and talk and laugh. And he was just a character. And the thing that I don't have in this obit is, somebody would go by and run into him, and he's sitting down at a table in Dornan's, and they say, "Good to see you, Bob." And he'd say, "Good to be seen." Because for him, anytime you're on this side of the earth and not pushing up daisies is a good day, right? And that joie de vivre, that I'm probably butchering the French pronunciation there, that zest for life that he had was just palpable. So I let it out with a story from Alan Simpson, who was childhood friends with Bob Dornan. And, Simpson comes upon Bob, and he's like outside of the wine shop, and he's just like stomping on cardboard boxes. And, Al Simpson's like, "What the hell are you doing?" And Dornan's like, "You just help me, you big bastard. You got a size 16, just get in here and help." And recycling was such a passion of his. And he was one of the first business owners in the Valley to really embrace, at first, cardboard recycling and glass. And he would take it upon himself to go down and just haul the stuff to Jackson and get it recycled every week. And he was a hero of recycling. But he was also just such a fun people person. And I interviewed all these people who worked for him, who said things like, you became part of the family. You weren't just an employee. And he particularly liked young women, probably because they wanted to dance with him. And he was a fantastic dancer, and he always wanted to dance. And he and his wife, Pat, were married 52 years, and they loved to dance. And she died before him, and he was heartbroken, but he kept dancing. He danced with all these young ladies who used to work for him and then became middle-aged ladies. And, he just kept on enjoying life. And I think, wine and dancing, that's what I think about when I think about Bob Dornan, and just socializing, enjoying other people. And he would have these chickadee lunches where he would take these former employees of his, and they would all go out to lunch, and then they would sit down and get pedicures, which is such a funny thing for me to think about when I look at Bob Dornan's face, him just enjoying pedicures. And you've seen that sign, I know you have, at the nail salon where it says, "Man feet, $5 extra." Because sometimes they don't get them often. It's sort of an ordeal, I suppose. But, I like hearing the words of the deceased as told to other people. And so even though it's third hand, I think it's worthwhile saying things like Amy McCarthy recounting how he told his chickadee group that he had cancer. He said to me, "I have no regrets. It's been a great life." If we can all say that at the end of our days, it's a beautiful thing.
And I think, Joanna, the fact that you left out your favorite part is pretty telling. I remember writing my grandpa's obituary, and when newsroom reporters have a luxury that I think a lot of family members don't when you're writing an obituary, which is that we can sit here and talk about how great it is, to start with one memory and whatnot. But when I was writing my grandpa's obituary, I come from a big family in Connecticut, and we probably had 13 or 14 people all sitting around a table. And my dad was like, "Well, you're studying English, you do it. And so I kind of, helped my dad organize these thoughts from everybody. And it's just, there's a lot of competing interests there. And at the end of the day, when you have 200 or 600 words, it sounds like a lot, but it's not as much as you'd think. Things are going to get left out, and that's okay. And, a newspaper article, a newspaper obituary, an obituary that you submit to the newspaper can't tell somebody's whole life. But it can speak to their character, like we've been saying, and it can speak to who they were and tell important details about them. And I read Joanna's thing when she sent it to me, and it doesn't tell that story about I can't remember the good to be seen anecdote, but it tells a lot more, and you still get a really good picture of who Bob Dornan was as a person. And Emily just joined us, and Emily is our Cops and Courts reporter. And if you want to introduce yourself, Emily, and just talk about the piece you wrote about the who was it, Wolfgang, over at Wolfgang Reckart at the Rose. I think that's an awesome story, and it's kind of a different look at this, and it's much more, it's kind of like Tom's, where there was an accident, and so we wrote about this person, but I think it shared a lot about who this person was.
Yeah, hi, I'm Emily. Sorry I was late. I got caught up at an assignment tonight. This story was a little bit more of a news story than a traditional obituary. And it was one of those that we found out about his death, and then I was able to just turn it pretty quickly. It was just a day turn story. Sometimes we have the luxury of working on news obituaries for a week or more. But I had done a close-up profile on Wolfgang a couple years prior. And so I was able to connect with some of his friends through his work at the Rose to give us some favorite memories of him. And this one too is probably unique because a lot of the news obits that we write are about prominent, long-time Jackson Hole residents. And Wolfgang had lived here a couple years, but he wasn't born and raised here like a lot of our subjects of news obits are. So.
Yeah, and there's I'm gonna pull it up real quick. I think when you're writing something that I think about a lot, the beginning is as important as the end is. And I remember reading this obit that Emily had written, and I picked it up and I was like, holy, I did not know Wolfgang, but he'd served me drinks at the Rose a bunch of times, and I was like, holy crap, that guy just died. I had no idea. And Emily had this great story in there about him, about like doing this drum show at the Wart, which I read about it, and I was like, who would show up to watch that? But apparently all of his friends showed up to watch it and loved it. And so he was like this drummer and this kind of this super interesting guy. And the way she ended it, like, if about, there's this, like, in rock and roll history, there's the idea of the 27th Club. There's like Kurt Cobain died when he was 27. He's the guitarist for Nirvana. Jimi Hendrix died when he was 27. I believe Janis Joplin died when she was 27. The way Emily ended it, I thought just like totally encapsulated how he lived and how his friends thought of him. And it kind of went like this. It said, many of his Jackson's friends are still shocked by the news of his death, but have taken to social media to share memories, many of them involving music. Duck, who was one of the friends that Emily referenced in the article, said his friend, quote, very annoyingly joined the 27th Club. I guess he just wanted to drum for Jimmy, Duck said. And it's just like such a heartfelt ending. And like, you're not always going to have when you're writing an obituary, you're not going to have a quote like that to end on. But I mean, when I read that, I didn't even know the guy, and it made me tear up. And I was like, that's a great ending. And so like when you're writing a story of or an obituary for someone, think about how you want to end that. And what if you have another good story you could end with, you can throw that in there too. But yeah, there's that.
Yeah, and this one too, it was having interviewed him like pretty recently before his death, and of course he's part of the news hook of this was he was a local and he was really young and he died tragically in a car accident out of state. But that, so that part's important to include, but also like talking to his friends and just trying to get across this guy's quirky personality. He had a lot of funny quirks, and you could tell that his friends loved him for that. And I thought that, like, those little things, trying to get his personality through the story too, I don't know, hopefully did his life justice to a degree.
I would say too, we keep talking about focusing on personality rather than on, a list of facts. The photograph for that story is a kind of the photographic equivalent of what we're talking about. We typically, when we get in a submitted obituary, you get a picture that was taken when somebody, received some award or something, a very stiff kind of photo. Here's a photo with personality. So, that really, it says something about the guy that, you would not get from a portrait shot or something like that. So if anybody who's going to write an obituary, if you're going to write your own obituary and hand it off to somebody for when you go, and you're going to put a picture, don't give them your high school graduation picture, or don't give them the picture when you were won some award or something. Finding a picture that captures the person as well, because this is a good example right here. I mean, you almost know the guy just looking at him.
Yeah, I think we also had a nice accompanying photo of one of his drum performances, which so that was, that's a really good point, Mark.
Totally.
One thing I was thinking about, just trying to think about translating what we've all been talking about to folks who are going to write an obituary, but I was trying to think about the funerals that I've spoken at, which are thankfully not many, but it comes natural to us as reporters to talk to a lot of people. Like, it's our job, and if we write a news obit, we're going to call 4 or 5 people at least that knew this person. But I think about when I've had to speak at funerals, like talking to family members or talking to friends of the deceased is sort of a way to get those juices flowing. And so I feel like if I was to approach writing an obit of a family member right now, reaching out to other family members, like they probably have stories that like you've never heard and are wonderful, or you have heard a million times, but maybe there's a detail you can't remember. And I feel like those conversations are, easy is not the right word, but a good way to sort of get into writing the obit, because if you do want to approach it from this like narrative standpoint that we're kind of discussing, it's a great way to find lots of information to decide what you want to include, rather than sitting alone at a computer trying to figure that process out.
Totally. And when my grandpa died, I remembered, and it didn't make its way into his eulogy, but I remember going around and talking with members of my family and being like, okay, well, what should we pop in here? And my little cousin, my grandpa was kind of like this crusty old guy, and he was a great guy, but like lived, breathed, and died in the same town that he grew up in Connecticut. Lived there, I think, for all 88 years of his life. And the man loved baseball, and he loved straight shooting. Like he didn't really mince his words. And there was one day, and my little cousin told me the story about, and that I'd never heard before. And he had a breezeway between the house and the garage. And it was like a little, basically enclosed porch for people who don't know what a breezeway is. And we used to go out and hit baseballs over the breezeway, and he'd stand on the other side and we hit baseballs over, and he'd go and run and catch them. And we did this for years. And then one day, my cousins were with him in the backyard, and they were playing catch. And, my little cousins got in a fight, and they were fighting and they were fighting, and he was just kind of standing there because he wasn't going to say anything. And all of a sudden my cousins were fighting, and then my little cousin just got hit in the face with a baseball, and he like fell to the ground. He was crying, and my other cousin's like, "Pop, why'd you do that?" And he just looked at him. He's like, "You should have put your glove up." And like, that story just like perfectly encapsulates who he is, and I had never heard that before. So like, it's like stuff like that you might find about someone that you never know. And we can talk about one more thing here, which is, I'll scroll down here. And this is, hold on. Yeah, so this is a story, to be clear, you guys, people here might know Willie. He is not dead. He is, to my knowledge, he's very much alive. He works over at the Center for the Arts. And, just going back to like character here, at the beginning of the pandemic, Willie, he does a bunch of stuff. I think he's the house manager over at the center. And this was a close-up. And this is just kind of to illustrate, let me just get my email out of here. Get out of here. There we go. Just to illustrate, like, what we're talking about applies whether you're just trying to write about somebody or write about somebody who's passed. He basically, I was like, honestly, scrambling last minute to find a close-up, which, we never do. But I was in that situation, and Melissa, who was our Valley editor at the time, told me, she's like, okay, well, this guy Willie would be great to talk to. And I was like, oh, I know Willie. I've talked to him a bunch of times. I used to be the arts and entertainment editor over here. And I was trying to figure out like what my angle about this was going to be. And he had just started, it was the beginning of the pandemic, and he had just started this show called Wednesdays with Willie, where he was just doing this Facebook live stream from the Center for the Arts. And I watched like 4 or 5 of them, and it was like him and his friends just doing like kind of weird stuff on video, just like kind of like spectacle humor. And then I scrolled down to one, and it was a combination video about him baking croissants and shaving his dog. And so he basically shaved his dog on Facebook Live for anybody to see. And so the whole story that I wrote here, and it like when I talked to the guy, it was like the perfect, like he's kind of a funny guy. He's a funny guy, and he's pretty quirky, and he's down to be a bit performative. And the whole close-up was about him shaving his dog on live television, or live online. And like, maybe that wouldn't make a great obituary, but if I had to give a eulogy for Willie Brooks, I would probably tell that story. So yeah, and it just kind of goes to show that like writing about somebody after they've died and writing about somebody who's living, the way you do it a lot of the times is the same. And I think what we could do also here, I don't know if people are
We have some
interested.
questions if we want to answer.
Oh yeah, let's answer some questions.
Julia had a question that, let's see. If you don't have a lot of knowledge about a notable figure's circle of friends before they die, how do you find the right people to talk to about the deceased? From a reporter's perspective, I know oftentimes we have deadlines we're working with, and so sometimes it'll come down to the first few people that you get a hold of who were close to that person, and others can probably speak to their processes. But I know with the Wolfgang story, I just called his, place of employment, and his manager, I asked his manager to do an interview, and his manager was like, well, I could talk to you about it, but here's, his best friend's number. Like, you should call him, and he'll have more thoughtful memories and more memories to share about him. So a lot of times it's just about making a lot of calls until you get a hold of the right person.
Yeah, I would second that. Like when I wrote about Stephen, it started from Rose Caiazzo did a Facebook post about it, or an Instagram post about it, and it started from there. And I got a hold of Rose, and she gave me one employer, who gave me a friend, who gave me a family member. And I think that Yeah, I think it's about like a volume of calls and hoping that some of them come back in the time that you need them to. Especially if you don't know much about the person, as I didn't really know anything about Stephen.
Mhm.
Yeah, and just from a reporting perspective, like I said, I have not written an obituary, but you always find like when it's Tuesday morning and the paper's got to go to print at 5 p.m. on Tuesday night, or your story's got to be in at 5 p.m. on Tuesday night, making those calls is terrifying. And you're just like, oh my God, I have to call and talk to these people about their friend that just died. And I think the wider the net of calls, you might make like 15 calls in a day and 2 people might call you back. But generally, the people that call you back, I feel like have something to say. And that's just a reporting thing in general that I've learned over the past like 2 years. Is you just kind of cast that wide net, and it's kind of cool to see where it ends up. Yeah. Yeah, next, I mean, so the other thing that we had talked about doing here, and, we got a lot of people, probably 10 or so people, maybe 12 people on here. Emily, did you see any other questions in there first?
So there is another question from Karen that Joanna took a stab at in the chat, but it's, do you have files of pre-written obit drafts of prominent citizens? Which I love this question because I moved here from Louisville, Kentucky, and I was a reporter there for a while. And the news station I worked at, we had an obituary ready for Muhammad Ali, who's from Louisville, famous boxer. We had his obit ready for like probably 5 years before he died. And it's like, it depends on, like, I think, around here, and Joanna took a stab at answering this about about being organized and if we can get around to it. But that's just an example of like a lot of news organizations around the country definitely have obits ready to go for the more famous locals that they cover.
And I think a great example of that, this is from national outlets, but when Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, I didn't see any story telling me that this happened, but just watching, it was like the news broke that Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, and every outlet that broke that news had a story that would take you like 40 minutes to read. And nobody found out about Ruth Bader Ginsburg dying and then wrote like a 10,000 word story about her. Like those were all pre-written. And so for notable people like that are, and with the details of when she died and how, and maybe the last few weeks or so of her life filled in. But those stories were just churned out instantly. And so it definitely does happen. Well,
it's a good idea to be ready. If when you get somebody who's tremendously important, and that if they're 90 years old, you don't want to be gruesome about it, but you got to figure that something is going to happen at some point. And there's a guy who used to work for the New York Times back in the 60s and 70s. His name was Alden Whitman. And he's the guy who invented the idea of calling up famous people and asking for an interview for their own obituaries. And he found that most people were actually quite open to it. Some people said no, they didn't want to think about it. But a lot of people, especially, like I say, when they were very old, they'd had many accomplishments, and it was almost an honor. They have the New York Times call up and say, "Can I have a couple hours of your time someday?" And it's just going to go in our files. It also helped him because he could say, "This is not going to be used until you are gone."
Yeah,
and that sort of like loosened up a lot of these people. Like I said, he found that he could call people up, and he didn't even have to explain himself almost at some point. A lot of these people just guessed exactly what he was about and said, "Okay, yeah, go ahead. What do you want to know?"
And we do have occasionally people who write their obituaries for themselves. They know they're ill and they're like, "Here we go. Here's my life story. you print it just like I said it, and you don't add anything after I die. Like, this is me. And so we have printed a few of those where, you know, there's a joke in the newsroom where, you know, we have Mark Huffman's obit ready to go.
I'm ready. Ready.
Even the headline's already written.
Yeah.
Pretty much. We won't give you the spoiler here, but
Here's my high school graduation picture, would you? Thanks.
Yeah. So we have a prompt, but you know, a writing prompt for people who are interested in writing their own, not writing their own obituaries, though you could use it to write your obituary for yourself. But you know, writing an obituary for a family member, a friend, whatnot. You know, just given the nature of the if some people are interested in taking a few minutes here, feel free to pop in the chat and say, yeah, let's go for it, let's do it. But basically, you know, Leah mentioned we had an idea of doing a quote unquote generative workshop, which means like we're going to give people the opportunity to write. And we had mentioned it in the daily clipping. So why don't we just do it? We have basically had a prompt that we talked about. And I'll share the screen here, and we'll give people like, you know, a few minutes if they want to give it a try. And we can come back and I'll do it while I'm sitting here too. So we have something to talk about in case people don't want to share. But basically we just wanted to give people the opportunity, and then we can probably wrap it up and just go to questions after that, to try and, you know, write something of their own here real quick. And you know, this might just be nice, like if you're not here because, you know, someone in your family is sick or has recently died, and you just want to, or even if you're in the latter situation, it's a good way to just, you know, get the gears turning on what you might want to include. And if you're in the former situation, like think of a friend, a family member, or whatever, a pet if you want to, and just think of like a memory like we've been talking about here that sticks out about them. And if you just scribble down a paragraph or two, just basically telling yourself that memory, yeah, you'll have it to hold on to, and it'll be a kind of a cool thing later on. And so, like I said, I have this memory bank, and I'm going to scribble down a memory of my friend, Sam. He was my roommate for 5 years in college. He's my best friend. And who knows, maybe I'll whip it out at his wedding speech someday. So like, and that's kind of what we wanted to challenge people to think about of this as, is like, think about it as you're writing 2 paragraphs of a speech you're going to give at somebody's wedding. And you know, hey, it might be more eulogistic. You might be able to roll it over into obituary someday. But yeah, we'll give like, you know, 5-10 minutes here. If you've got that up, you can go for it. And if anybody wants to share, feel free to. Otherwise, I'll share my memory of my friend Sam. So we'll give everybody a few minutes here. And we'll pop back in at like, yeah, am I muted? I don't think I'm muted. Pop back in at like 7:25-ish. So people want to, if you don't want to write anything, no worries. We'll just be back.
Oh.
All right, we'll pop back in like a minute here. So if you're writing and want to share, think if you want to share, and we'd be happy to have you. If not, I'm happy to share what I wrote or what I was thinking about. Why don't we? Yeah,
This is Karen Drigger, and I'm not going to read mine, but I
sure.
just wanted you to know that that was actually really fun and a really helpful exercise. So I'm, but I'm a slow thinker and slow reader, so I'll work on it later. And but thank you. I was not very enthusiastic about giving it a try, but once I started, I thought this is awesome. So thanks.
That's great to hear, and I think that's kind of how writing goes in general. For me, whenever I do this for a living, I guess, and I guess all of us from the News and Guide here do. But whenever I have to sit down and write a story, it's like pulling off my fingernails, and then I start doing it, and it's super fun. So I'm super glad to hear that, and thanks. Yeah. Thanks for that, Karen. Yeah. Does anybody want to share what they wrote? If not, I've got a picture and a story I can share, and then we can take some questions and wrap it up.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, good. My mom is 97, and she lives out at Legacy Lodge. And so I've been, thinking about writing her obituary, and I have some of it written. But this is so good to know, to put in something light and funny. And so I am going to do that. So this is what I'm going to write. One of the male nurses came into her room, and he's very good looking. He's in his 40s, and he's just darling. Okay. And he said, "Ruth, let me rub your legs with some lotion." He says, "They're just kind of splotchy and they're rough." He says, would you let me lotion your feet and your legs?" And she said, "No." And he said, "Well, why not?" And she says, "You might get excited."
Perfect. That's exactly it.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for sharing. And what was your name?
I'm Connie Owen. I write Circling the Square.
Oh, hey, Connie. Right on. I didn't recognize you.
I know. I don't look so good in these days of pandemic.
It's okay. You can't tell, but I haven't showered in 2 days, so here we are. But thank you so much for sharing. Would anybody else like to share the? Oh, Leah, you got one?
Yep. Well, and it's about my grandmother, whose name is also Ruth. And she just turned 100 this summer. And I was also thinking, like, I was really impressed, or just kind of like thinking about Emily's story on Wolfgang, because I didn't know him that well either, but I interacted with him in a very small window basis with the story slams. And like, I had really interesting interactions with him that totally fit into the profile that you wrote. So I'm like, this is really fascinating to me that someone has a really consistent public persona. Like, how is a personality so consistent? So then I'm thinking about my grandmother, and she is somebody who is very complex to me, and who I have a fraught relationship with too, right? And I credit her for giving me a lot of complexes and stuff like that. So how do I write positively about someone who also I have this fraught relationship with? So that's also something that's churning in my head. But so here's my anecdote about her. once Bubby sent me, when I first moved to Jackson, a lemon from her lemon tree in Florida. And it was a really big lemon, and it was round, and it almost looked like a grapefruit. And you could have mistaken it for a grapefruit, but she had written in black Sharpie in all caps the word lemon on the rind so that I would know what it was. And then she also sent me a lemon cake made from one of her lemons in the lemon tree that was wrapped in multiple layers of tinfoil to protect it. So it's a story about rinds and protection and layers and labeling so that I would not mistake something for something else. And so it's her way of loving me.
I love that detail. That's good.
Yes.
Really.
Would you like to go, Phoebe?
I love the unidentifiable lemon, and the fact that she knew that it would be unidentifiable.
Or she didn't trust me to like trust her that in the letter
That's what
lemon,
That's
or
what I was gonna
the
say.
double layers.
That's what I was gonna say. Is like, I don't know your grandmother, but I read that detail as, I want to make sure that Leah doesn't get this wrong.
Does anyone else have anything they want to share?
I know I wonder with those last two stories,
Yeah.
I know sometimes I think about, and if I lived closer to my grandmother, she's 95, and sometimes I want to do like, I'm like, oh, next time I'm home, I'm going to do this because this is inspiring me to do it. But I want to do like an audio interview with her, just record it on my iPhone and talk about like basically just an audio diary of her life. And not for anything. I mean, but it's like one of those things that I think, we sometimes don't pause long enough to do something like that. And I think about the people who, might pass away soon or in the next 5 to 10 years, that like, it would be really nice to just have like, their voice telling parts of their story, which could also be used when writing an obituary. And I don't know if that's anything that anyone else has considered doing or has used a resource like that before, but it's something that I hope to do with my grandma.
And something like along those lines that I do, and just on your phone, I'll show you on mine. If you have an iPhone, you have this voice memo app, which is really great. And that's how I'll show you what it looks like. It's just this little guy right there. And it's probably under your utilities or something on your phone. But if you just search voice memo on your iPhone, you can find it. And I sneakily record members of my family all the time. So we'll goad my grandpa into telling stories about, he was in Vietnam, and we'll goad him into telling stories about Vietnam, and he was a fighter pilot and whatnot. And whenever he does it, the thing you should know, most states are one-party recording states, so you can record without asking the other person. So I have a lot of recordings of my grandpa telling stories about that sort of stuff. So you don't even have to sit down, because a lot of people, my grandpa, if I told him I was doing that, he'd be like, well, what are you doing, preparing for when I die? I'm like, no, I'm just keeping track of this stuff. So
alternately, you could just say, yeah, so what?
Yeah, or you can be sneaky about it. But I think it's you can totally do that. And the other thing that I really love are voicemails. And I have voicemails on my phone. And my grandpa, who did die, he had a habit of picking up the phone. He would just call, because my grandma would be working and he'd be at home, and he would call just kind of once a week, just make a round and call everybody on their cell phone. And he would always start it off by saying the same thing. He'd be like, hey Billy, it's your old man calling. And then he would list the time and then tell you what he was doing, and then tell you that he's hoping you're doing good and wonder what you're doing. And I still have a voice recording of his that I've never listened to on my phone. But you can save those things forever, and you can export them and put them on your computer or in a Google Drive. So with technology, there's all kinds of stuff you can do to keep memories of people. And like, even if you're having, if you're sitting around on keeping it light, if you're sitting around the dinner table with a bunch of friends, and maybe it's not a pandemic time, but you're doing that You could sneakily put your phone in the middle of the table and type and hit record. And if you're all just having a rip-roaring good time and drinking wine and whatnot, you might want to remember that moment too. And that's a way you can do it. So there's all kinds of cool stuff you can do.
Yeah, those are great ideas.
Yeah. Does anyone have any questions for us or anything? We've been at it for an hour and a half, and from doing library forums, I know that's kind of the upper bar on how people can stand a Zoom meeting. But if anyone has any questions, happy to answer them. Otherwise, thank you guys all so much for coming, and to Leah for organizing this, and for Emily, Joanna, Tom, and Mark for downloading Zoom and getting on here. I think your perspective was super valuable, and thanks everyone for coming out.
There's
Thank
a
you.
question in the Zoom chat from Laura about, is there a second writing exercise that you had planned to share?
We can-
She just wanted to grab that from you before it was too late, if you had another one. But I just want to say, Billy, thank you so much for facilitating this, and Leah for asking us. It's really an honor to talk about what we do, because I do believe it's a great privilege and honor and responsibility to record these community stories for perpetuity. Newspapers are the first draft of history, and the library has a wonderful partnership with us for newspapers.com. So basically every newspaper since 1911 is on the internet, thanks to the library and the News and Guide archives. And it's an incredible searchable resource. You can search it for free if you're at the library or using their Wi-Fi, or you can get an inexpensive membership to newspapers.com, or you can do a trial. I just have one quick little, I just wrote about my sister for one little paragraph. She's not elderly and she's not sick, so it feels like I'm jinxing her. But I just wanted to say real quickly, we were making the full-size guest bed at Papa's house, and she wasn't pulling her side of the bedspread evenly. We argued over whose side wasn't straight, and I threw a book at her. The thick Reader's Digest condensed book, popular in the 70s. It broke her finger, but it didn't dissuade her from her belief that she was correct. As a social justice activist and minister, she continues to fight for the oppressed, the downtrodden, the disadvantaged, and she doesn't back down. So that's just what I came up with.
There we go. Yeah, mine was about my roommate, my 5-year roommate, Sam, lighting his mattress on fire in college by accident while we were at a job fair. So that'll be in his wedding speech. So I'll tell you sometime. Yeah, Tom or Emily, do you have another writing prompt? If not, I'm sure we could cook one up and we could throw one up on the website with like a little recap and a link to this video if people want to watch it later on.
I think we could do that. I think we could come up with another one. I think that'd be a good way to cap this.
Absolutely.
This was so great. I didn't know all that about like the capitalistic side of the obituaries and the publication aspects of it, which like I didn't know. I want to know these things. Like this is really fascinating, like how the stories get decided and the interview process. This is really wonderful. You guys are pros. I felt real great. Not that I doubted my local paper, but wow, just to be reminded what talent and care we have. We are lucky. We are lucky in this town.
Thanks, Leah.
Yeah.
And we're lucky to have a public library that hosts these sorts of things and tries to keep people being lifelong learners, which is important to us.
Any last questions? Okay. So yeah, so you can find this video on our YouTube site, the Teton County Library 2020, or I'll post it on our Let's Talk About Death series website as well. And then I can also email it to the News and Guide if they want to put it somewhere else too. And then once everybody emails me the prompt, I will update the website too, so you can check it there. So great. And if you have any questions for it, you can email me. I'll put my email in the chat. adultevents@tclib.org. But
Thank you so
thank
much,
you so
everybody.
much.
Thanks for listening to a few of us, young reporters talk about obituaries and whatnot. We appreciate it.
I loved it. This is great.